WBNE.
Hello and welcome to episode 177, all about the Silmarillion, of the Third Age and the Rings of Power, being the 177th part of That's What I'm Tolkien About. Hello, my name is Mary Clay. If that's too complicated for you, just call me MC. I've been experiencing the world of J.R.R. Tolkien for the first time, and right now I'm reading the Silmarillion, so you don't have to. Today I'm joined by sci-fi and fantasy content creator, Kritter XD. Welcome!
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And one of your, another critter just joined the screen, by the way. I always have to point out when pets show up in the background, so.
Yeah, Agni says hi. An orange fluffy cat that some of the people that are familiar with my content are familiar with.
Wonderful. Oh my gosh. If I wasn't allergic to cats, I would want a black cat first, but an orange cat would be my next choice. Anyway, enough about cats. Why don't you tell me and the listeners a little bit about your, I know that Wheel of Time is really your bread and butter, but what's your background / experience like with Lord of the Rings? How did you first get introduced to it? All that jazz?
Sure. So actually, even though Wheel of Time is kind of my bread and butter, the thing that got me into fantasy in the first place was The Hobbit. So I've told the story before, but obviously not on this podcast because it's my first time. But my mom is a teacher, and so she was off in the summers, and one of the activities that she would have us do would be to go to the library. And so I was a huge reader, and so I was just, I tried mystery books, I tried all kinds of books, and one day I was walking down one of the aisles, and I saw a red dragon on a cover of a book, and I was oh man, okay, this hat, I'm interested. So I got it. Turns out it was The Hobbit, and I loved it. And then after I read The Hobbit, I somehow found out that, J.R.R. Tolkien had more books. What? Shocking revelation. And so then I read the trilogy. And then when the movies came out, it was all over for me. They've been my favorite movies since they came out, and they've got insane nostalgia factor for me, and I adore The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien for all of the just awesome vibes that I've gotten from it since I was 10 years old.
That's awesome. And when I reached out to you, I was like, do you by any chance have any experience with the Silmarillion? Have you read it? So what made you decide to take the plunge?
So I know some people might really dislike to hear this, but whenever I found out that the Rings of Power was going to come out, I was getting, some spicy comments. Well, spicy's the wrong. I was getting some comments on my videos where I was talking about how I was excited about the Rings of Power, that I wasn't a real fan. I'm sure you've experienced them.
Yes,
you're not a real fan. And so I was like, you know what, bet. If me not knowing the Silmarillion is the thing between me being a real fan and not a real fan, and just to be clear, I don't subscribe to that.
Yes,
anybody can be a real fan.
It's a completely stupid notion.
So dumb.
Because as I have experienced, and as I'm sure you experienced, the Silmarillion is one of the hardest books to read.
Yes.
So it's a completely inaccessible form of fandom. So if that's the thing setting people apart from being a real fan, then fine, I'm not a real fan,
You can think that, but so I would just basically to shut up the haters. I was like, fine. Now I read audiobooks like I didn't back in the day. And so maybe that is how I'm going to finally finish this book, because I had tried. So I got it on audiobook and I read it, and some parts, I won't lie, I did glaze over occasionally. I'm not a battles girly. And so sometimes when that's certain fights were happening, I would just kind of
I mean, Tolkien also is not a battles girly. He also glazes over things.
It's true. So I made it through, though. There were some parts that I really, really loved in the Silmarillion. There were some parts that I could take or leave, but overall I finished, and I'm really, really glad that I did.
That's amazing. That's really awesome. And then I dragged you back to it to read it again. And listeners, I did make her read the entire thing. No, I'm just kidding.
No, not quite. No, not quite.
That would be insane if that was a requirement for each of my guests. That like, hey, you have to read everything that came before the part that we're discussing. That would just be nuts.
This part especially,
especially because we're at the end right now. Yeah. So we are discussing the first half. Again, I'm splitting these up just to make them more digestible. This is of the Rings of Power. Oh no, I've been saying it wrong this whole time. I thought it was of the Third Age and the Rings of Power. It's of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Dang it. Okay, well, whatever. You get the point.
Yeah.
And then it's subtitled, In Which These Tales Come to Their End. And I was like, yay!
Here we are.
We're almost done. So we're kind of... But now we're backtracking. So we just saw the fall of Numenor and everything last week and in the previous section. But we're going to jump back a bit further to the end of the giant... What do they call it? It's like Dagoreth or something. It's the giant war that they had where they finally defeated Melkor. He got shoved into a void somewhere. The Silmarils were lost to... humanity, lots of fun stuff, lots of death, amazing. And there's a moment where Sauron, who, reminder for everyone, in the First Age, I don't even know, were we in the Second Age during all of this? I needed to look that up, whatever. Previously, Sauron was Melkor's right-hand man. He was... his best soldier, his advisor, everything. Melkor's gone, and Sauron has a chance to repent. And at first, it kind of seems like he might. People are thinking that he has realized that, all of this was kind of not great of me. My bad. But then it's the messenger of Manwë, Eonwë, who says, well, I'm not the one who can say whether or not you're good to go. That's up to Manwë, so you need to go talk to him. And Sauron's like, but I think he's going to yell at me if I go, so I'm not. Bye.
Hard pass.
Yes. Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation and to receive from the Valar a sentence. It might be of long servitude in proof of his good faith, for under Morgoth his power had been great. So he's like, I had a pretty good thing going under Morgoth. I'm not going to throw that out the window. Bye. I'll just go, sulk in the darkness for a while. Then... The elves, everything is being reconstructed because Beleriand was essentially ruined in this war. So they're rebuilding their lives, and we'll be glad to know. I'm like so done with the elves by this point, like God's favorite child, quite literally.
The first.
Oh my gosh, the firstborns. And so, they create a harbor called the Grey Havens. I'm sure we're all Lord of the Rings people. We're familiar with that. That's where Frodo leaves at the end of Return of the King. And that is where the Eldar ever and anon set sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of earth. For by the mercy of the Valar, the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Erisea and Valinor beyond the encircling sea. So they get a happy ending. Everyone else, screw you. It kind of describes, I guess, what I would call a migration of what's up with the survivors of this war. Elves are going from, because they were all in Beleriand, and so it's saying, the Teleri, who were survivors of Doriath and Osiriand. That's right, because I think Doriath was taken down, and then they fled, and then they all have to flee again because everything is ruined.
There's so many names in the
life.
Silmarillion. It is so funny.
Those are the only, like I remember those, and I know what those are because I I think only out of pure repetition and because it's more recent in my brain. Don't you worry. We will get to a point in this section where things like are supposed to sound familiar and I'm like, I don't know. I could be reading those words for the first time. And I know that it is not the first time that like it was mentioned and dropped in other works that I have already read and promptly forgotten. But yeah, everyone's just kind of rebuilding their lives and things are doing okay. As far as okay as you can be when there's been a giant war that's completely like destroyed your world.
Right. Things are sort of looking up. From a war, at least, comparatively.
They're at least able to like catch their breath a bit. Oh, I do want to mention though, they do call out that, where is it? I think they're talking about, that's right, they're talking about Eregion, which viewers of Rings of Power, we know what Eregion is because we saw a lot of the story taking place there. It mentions that Eregion was built, but that it was not built to like the same strength and likeness of Khazad-dûm, and I love that they gave that credit to the dwarves in this little even though it's like not that much, but it's nice that they're acknowledging the dwarves are really great craftsmen. Khazad-dûm is where it's at. And, we did our thing with Eregion. It works for us, and that's what matters. But Khazad-dûm, they definitely outdid themselves there.
For sure, yeah. I love a couple of the things they say about the dwarves in this section to me, like, kind of crack me up. Because at times they'll, like, give them props, and then at other times they're like, but they're still kind of greedy.
I'm constantly reminded that the Silmarillion is from the perspective of the elves.
Yeah.
Because it definitely comes off as like a very biased history.
Yep, it does.
Yeah, remember how I said things are going great? Well, Sauron is here to deal with that. He's been growing in power, obviously. He learns to kind of, to work his dark crafts in more creative ways, and really hone in on those like cunning and craftiness skills. So he's aware that the elves he's giving them props. He's like, they're very smart, they're very powerful, they have all this knowledge, they've created all of these weapons, and they have all these skills. Like, I need to go amongst them and undermine them somehow or steal some knowledge or something from them. He's like, that's where it's at. So he went far and wide among them, and his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. So he's putting on this guise.
The Anatar guise, right? That's I love that name. Like, it's a good name.
He becomes Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. And this is something that a lot of people were dropping and referencing during Rings of Power. And I was like, I don't know who that is. I'm like, it was and I think at one point I did acknowledge, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna ask who is that? Because everyone's talking about this guy, like I know who it is, and someone said, oh, it's just Sauron, but in one of his like early disguises, and I was like, okay, that makes sense.
It's sexy Sauron. That's what we think of him as. Yeah, actually, in Rings of Power, there was one time where he said something like, think of it as a gift, and I feel like like me having just read the Silmarillion, I was like, oh, think of it as a gift.
Yeah,
I see what you're doing there.
Yes, they definitely it's the. He's looking fair and wise. I think they definitely, although he's definitely in the show, he was definitely more ruggedly handsome, more that Aragorn type. Anyway, yeah, he becomes Anatar, the Lord of the Gifts. Worth mentioning, though, that, again, this is all the Silmarillion that the show does not have rights to, so there are differences. And this is one of the differences that a lot of people were bringing up after the finale, because in this text, it says that Sauron does not go to Lindon, and he does not deceive Gil-galad and Elrond. Both were like, nah, we don't trust you. Something feels off.
This is sus. Very, very sus.
They're like, I'm not sure about this. So no, you can't come hang out with us. So that's like I think a pretty big difference between when everyone is screaming about, but it's not canon. That's like a pretty big difference from the show.
I guess so, to me, like, similar things happened with the Wheel of Time show, where it was like, okay, if you're looking fundamentally, it looks somewhat different, right? Gil-galad and Elrond, don't trust him. But when you think about how it all played out in the show, like, Elrond almost immediately learned not to trust him, right? It was not long before Elrond got the deets or whatever and was just like, oh gosh, what's going on? So I feel like they got to the same place. They just took a different route.
Different,
right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like what a lot of what I found, like, book to show adaptations end up doing. It's like, you might take a different path,
that's
but you're going for the same, he's a human, for example, rather than like pretending to be an elf, which I feel like, wasn't Anatar supposed to be elfy, kind of?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the other differences, is that I think this like disguise that he's using to fool people, I think he's supposed to be more like a Legolas type, than an Aragorn type. And so in the show, he's more Aragorn, and in the Silmarillion, I think Anatar is supposed to be more like a fair-looking, beautiful elf rather than like ruggedly handsome.
So different, but
yeah.
We end up in the same place in the end.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah, so he is Anatar now, and he is like, wow, there's a lot to be gained here from... It says a lot to gain from his friendship, so he is like passing on knowledge to them. Again, like this craftiness that he has. But of course, he's learning things about them as well. It's so random, because they just kind of gloss over the fact that they make the rings of power.
I know, right? It's just like, oh, I guess that happened.
Yeah. So he's like learning more and working with the smiths. And eventually it just says, in those days, the smiths of Austin Edhill, I don't know where that is. I'm assuming it's something in Eregion or Lindon or whatever. In those days, the smiths surpassed all that they had contrived before, and they took thought and they made the rings of power. But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and to bring them under his vigilance. So that's kind of it. It just says they took thought, this like knowledge that they have learned from Sauron. And then they made the rings of power, and that's that. That's that on that. It's very confusing.
Yeah.
And I was a little disappointed, because I was also disappointed in the show's finale, because I was like, I feel like we really rushed the whole making of the Rings of Power thing. Like, that's the name of the show. We didn't really start talking about it until like the last 20 minutes of the finale. I would really love to like see more of that, but it turns out there's not
more.
Much. Yeah. It just says, now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others. And so, again, just like he made the one ring.
Yeah, there it is. Found it.
Yeah. I was also kind of like, it's also a bit confusing, because I think it mentions... See, like, it kind of glosses over things, because... So I think all of the elves made all of the rings of power. Is that what it's implying by now? The elves made many rings?
Yeah, I think so. That's something I didn't realize before the second read.
Yeah. And it's very confusing to me, because I hope this is a change that they'll make in the show. I really thought with the dwarves' like background in mining and everything that they would make their own rings of power, but apparently the elves made the rings of power for them and gave them to them.
That's 100% what I was expecting. Just once again, the elves being... Although, if this is from the perspective of the elves, maybe it's just them taking credit when they shouldn't have. Who knows?
That's true. Yeah, I have...
Unreliable narrator,
no
perhaps.
clue. Yeah, totally. Especially like when it comes to the dwarves, it's very difficult to see like what... Like that. Those were some like really interesting dynamics that I liked watching in the show, was like... Some of the elves doing stuff with the dwarves, and like they I know the mithril thing is kind of all over the place, but it didn't sit right with me that they like stole the mithril, that one little ore, and then the dwarves were like, no, you can't have any. And then they're like, that's fine, we'll use this one ore and we'll make the rings of power and we'll be better than you. And lots of like interesting dynamics with the dwarves going on.
Yeah, I liked a lot of the dwarf scenes the best, but the mithril thing was kind of hilarious.
It's all over the place.
Like, what's going on?
Yeah, definitely like gave me a bigger appreciation for the dwarves, and so now reading this, I'm like really I'm like looking for those signs of like, you know, giving the dwarves credit where credit is due, and like praising their work and their skills. And supposedly they did not make their own rings, and so that's very sad for me to hear. I'm sure someone will tell me I completely read all that wrong, or this is not the full version of the story, and I have to go read something else.
I think you're reading it right, though. That's the vibe I got too. Was that the elves made them all, which was not what I expected.
Sauron, secretly, I was also in this chapter was, you know, Cate Blanchett's ethereal voice in the prologue of Fellowship of the Ring was just in the back of my head the whole time I was reading this. And when she goes, but all of them were deceived. Because Sauron, yes, like I said, Sauron secretly made the one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And then it also says, while he wore the one ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. So that's something that kind of clarifies. I remember when I was reading Lord of the Rings, I was like, so what does the ring do?
Yeah.
Like, what exactly does it do besides make you invisible?
Right.
And even that has like a lot of questions, because in the prologue, Sauron is wearing the ring, but he's not invisible. And then people are like, well, maybe he's invisible inside his armor.
Hey, maybe.
It's ridiculous. So I think it mentions that one of the rings I think it's maybe the men's ring, allows them to like run around without being like perceived by others or something. So if the one ring is giving you the power of all of them, it would make sense that like that's the one that they can use. I don't know.
Yeah, it does. Although I was kind of confused by this part too, because in the chapter it says like Celebrimbor made the three rings for the elves that weren't under Sauron's influence, right? It said something like he made them independently, but then right after that it says, but they're still subject to the One Ring's power. And I was like, but so what's the significance of him making them independently then? Like, I don't know. Like, it was kind of bizarre to me.
Yeah. So here's some of the background on the elven rings. We know there are 3 of them. I love making the joke of, so they're called Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. I love making the joke of like, what's that? Nenya what? Nenya business.
Okay,
like
nice,
I'm
love it.
Freaking, 10 years old or whatever. So we have the 3 elven rings, and of all the elven rings, Sauron most desire, and of all, it's so hard when there's not punctuation. Oh my God.
Yes.
And of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them. For those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. Which, side note, can't elves do that anyway?
Yeah.
Aren't elves like that anyway?
Well, this to me kind of like, again, we keep talking about Rings of Power, and I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but it kind of...
I always say, I'm like, oh, we're not going to talk that much about it, but I think it's like, it's so fresh in all of our heads.
Yeah.
It's like, this section is literally called Of the Rings of Power. We're going to talk about the show.
So like, for me, this kind of like pinged me to the fact that the elves were like, waning, or like their magic or life powers or whatever, they were like growing dim, whatever the heck that was supposed to be. To me, it's like, oh, but if they have these 3 rings, they can push away the darkness of the world.
Yeah.
Whatever.
They can stave off death for another million years, like they've already done. I'm like, maybe it's just your time.
Yeah, right.
Maybe it's just time to die.
Yeah, that's something. It's just a bunch of vampires.
I started. It's just so funny because, like, I know when I first started reading Lord of the Rings, I was so intrigued by the elves, and I was like, these guys are the coolest.
So cool.
Like, I want, like, if I was a character in Lord of the Rings, I think I'd want to be an elf. But then the more I learn about them, I'm like, nah, screw these guys. They're like, they're like colonizers. They have a very like biased history. It's the exact thing of like who writes history? The winners. And so you don't hear about, like the dwarves, for example. So
I'll be a Maiar. That'll be what I choose.
Oh, okay, there you go.
I used to say elf too, but now I'm like, I'm gonna upgrade. Like we're gonna take that
nowadays. Nowadays, I think the safe choice is just a hobbit.
Oh well. Yes.
And not one of them that goes on an adventure.
Yeah, the Shire is it's pretty great. Looks pretty great to me.
Yeah, I think I'll stay there and just not leave, which isn't much different. As someone who works remote full time, is not much different than my regular life. So
yeah, I was actually Frodo for Halloween, and I can also attest to their clothes. Very comfortable.
Yes.
Loose and they're barefoot all the time. Everybody loves that. Like, yeah, hobbits, they're onto something.
Yeah. That's right. We were trying to figure out like what's going on. Yeah, it says, but Sauron could not discover them, for they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly while Sauron kept the ruling ring. So I think what happened was that the elves made all of the rings. Sauron knew that this was happening, so he made the one ring. And that's when in the prologue, Galadriel says, but all of them were deceived, and that's when he makes the one ring. But after he makes it, the elves are no longer deceived. They're like, we can sense, we know what's going on. We know that there's this greater power out there, so we're not going to use our rings anymore because we don't want to risk him getting his hands on them. And as long as we're not using them, then then they're safe.
Using them openly, whatever that means.
Yeah, again, I don't know.
Hey,
I don't know. It's a lot of semantics.
Mysteries are fun. What can I say?
I totally like glossed over like Celebrimbor and everything, but yeah, just worth mentioning. Yeah, Celebrimbor is the reminder for everyone. He is the son of Curufin, who it was always like Curufin and Celegorm, who were like a duo together. And remember, they are the worst. They are the ones who in Beren and Luthien go like chasing after Luthien, and I think they kidnap her. Also, like another testament to their like lack of character. Who Are the Hound was one of their dogs, and he like immediately ditched them when he was like, yeah, they're not. I don't think they're good. I don't think my owner is a good person. Let me go.
#Team Whoor.
Do something else. Yes. So Celebrimbor, however, it says, was estranged from his father. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool then.
Better dude.
As long as you don't have any relationship with your terrible father, that's cool to me. So then Sauron starts going to war. It says, from that time, war never ceased between Sauron and the elves. And Eregion was laid waste. Spoiler alert for Rings of Power! Celebrimbor slain, and the doors of Moria were shut. Again, like with the I just noticed though, again with like the elves talking about the dwarves, it says the war never ceased between Sauron and the elves, but then it says the doors of Moria were shut. So clearly, like they were also like the dwarves were also, on some kind of the battle front.
I mean, unless they were like hiding.
Yeah, or they go into hiding or something. But I feel like something would have had to happen with the dwarves that they're like, we're closing up shop.
Yeah.
Bye. Don't.
Yeah.
We'll see you in, centuries when a hobbit knocks a bucket down a well.
Right.
Yeah, huge battle, everything going on. This is, again, where I get confused. So I think, it says Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them out to the other peoples of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarves, and to the men he gave 9. So again, very confusing. So the elves made a whole bunch of rings of power, and then they were just going to hoard them. And then they decided to just keep 3, and Sauron got all but 3 of them. And then he gave the dwarves 7 of them. And then later it mentions that, like, Sauron later recovered some of that. So I'm like, Sauron, why would you give them the rings only to want to take them back? I'm very confused because...
Yeah,
it's just he's just like kind of like really speeding through this what seems to be very crucial part of this history, and yet in a minute he will talk about a tree for a paragraph.
Yeah, I think like what I found interesting about the Sauron like dealing out the rings to the dwarves and the men, other than obviously like the ring rates becoming a thing, but when he mentions the dwarves, it's like it says, they're not really susceptible to evil, so that wasn't a problem. But they were worried about they were consumed with wealth. So I love how the elves the narrator is just like, yeah, good for the dwarves, but also like. They still suck.
They were greedy as hell. Yeah.
it gives and it takes away for the poor dwarves.
It also, it says the dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. That's like a very, negative way of saying like they resisted being ruled by a dark overlord. Yeah. Like that's a really, like, that's what you say about like a wild animal,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so fascinating the way that the dwarves are treated in the Silmarillion.
Like, I really have come around on the dwarves. They weren't necessarily like my favorite group, but like learning more about them through the elves' point of view and seeing like how much they've gotten the short end of the stick. Mm-hmm. I'm like, you know what? You guys are great.
Mm-hmm. At the very beginning of this chapter too, it says like, this is a time where elves and dwarves got along. And then that was like pretty much it for the positive stuff about the dwarves. Other than Khazad-dûm, obviously. The Khazad-dûm shout out.
I'm confused by that too, because it said that, they started like, they had a pretty good friendship going on because Eregion, I guess, or Lindon was near Khazad-dûm, or I don't know, they had like a pathway or something that connected it. So like they were forging these relationships with the dwarves, between the elves and the dwarves. And so I'm like, but then how did we get to the point in Lord of the Rings where there's this big feud that, we see between Gimli and the elves, Yeah. And like, because I was like, oh, a couple chapters ago, the whole thing happened where the dwarves they like forced their way into Doriath and killed the king and stole one of the Silmarils. And I was like, oh, that's why they have beef. But now they seem to be okay with each other again. Yeah. And then we get to not being okay with each other again later. I don't know.
Isn't there something in The Hobbit?
It's a lot.
Don't the elves come to help the dwarves and then they just leave?
Yeah, it's very confusing. There's a whole part where they go into, there's a chapter where they stay in Rivendell, and there's no sense of like the dwarves were uncomfortable being around the elves, and the elves were shooting, giving them a side eye and all this. Like they had a merry old time in Rivendell and had no problem, except they were like, hey, your singing is keeping us awake. And that was it.
Yeah.
Interesting dynamics.
It is. It's got its ups and its downs. Let's just put it that way.
But anyway, so the dwarves, they were given 7 rings, and they're not turning evil, but they used their rings only for the getting of wealth. But wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. Also, I think like in that statement, we can determine that that's, the dwarves dug too greedily in Moria, I think is the line that Gandalf says, or someone, and they awoke a Balrog. So I think we can infer that like they dug too greedily because they were under the influence of their own rings, or that's what they were using their rings for.
Doing the Dark Lord's work without even knowing it. Poor guys.
Yes, true. All the gold and everything that they dug up was useless because dragons devoured them. And some of the 7 rings were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. I feel like we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
That, like, Sauron has some of the dwarven rings.
Yeah. I just assumed they had them all the time, you know? They're just around.
Or, yeah.
Obviously not.
It's like, so what... Oh, that's right. The whole point is he's trying to get the one ring back. Anyway, I forgot the plot of Lord of the Rings for a minute. It's fine.
Well, it's fine. Yeah.
However, men proved easier to ensnare, of course. And we know what happens here. They are all corrupted and eventually turn into Nazgul. This is the ring. These are the rings that give them the power. I don't know if it like willingly gives them the power of invisibility, but it does make them invisible. So I wonder if that's like why when Frodo puts on the one ring, he turns invisible. If it's like operating under the powers of the other rings. One by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore and under the domination of the One, and became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. So that is how we see them pretty much depicted in the Lord of the Rings movies. Is they're these cloaked figures, and then when Frodo puts on the ring, he can see them, and they're like the, you know, old men, creepy old men. Yeah.
Skeleton men guys.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I think Sauron is like, okay, cool. I am gonna put this on pause and I'm gonna go mess with Numenor. BRB.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Good plan.
Also, that's what I was going to say. During this time, a lot of the elves start taking that, you know, one-way ticket to Valinor. And this is known as, it says, thus the Black Years began, which elves call the Days of Flight. So this is when a bunch of the elves just start hightailing it out of Middle-earth. Can't say I would blame them.
Yeah.
Because this war, this very, like, wrathful, evil person is, you know, warring with them for years and years. So they're like, it sounds like a you problem, dwarves and men. Bye.
Yeah. Okay. Peace out. Like, have fun with that.
Yeah, it's really funny because it then, like, very quickly summarizes Akalabeth. And it's like, yeah, and then you know the story. Sauron went to Numenor and he led to their downfall and all this other stuff happened. And then even though the Valar basically just, you know, like ripped Arda in half and drowned everyone, Sauron, you know, is a spirit being and he flees to Mordor to recover. So now we are officially picking up where we left off at the end of Akalabeth, where all of that doom and destruction happened. And there are a group of faithful Númenóreans who were able to escape. Because remember, everyone, they followed God. They listened to the one and true God, and they were saved from the apocalypse.
Wow.
It reads way too much. Like, it's vastly apparent to me that Tolkien was Catholic.
Yes, but also possibly anti-capitalist, you know? Like, the dwarves are too greedy, too much gold, you know?
Yes.
It's not the good.
He has a lot of very apparent like morals that come through. Like, I was a part of this live stream event a couple of weeks ago with Fandom Forward, and we were talking about it was all about surrounding like the topic of midterm elections and stuff, and we were talking about climate change, and like the climate isn't really something that you're like, oh, Tolkien really talks that, but like he really does. When you really like pay attention, there are huge themes of like nature and preserving it and everything. Like there are a lot of, you know, stances that Tolkien, you know, clearly were an important part of his life that he wrote into his works.
He was really into trees. What does that say, you know? There's a lot of
trees. Okay, yeah. This is when it starts describing things in Middle Earth that I'm like, yeah, I think some of this was told to me in Lord of the Rings, but I don't remember. And I'm like, I think this is all supposed to start sounding familiar, but some of it isn't.
Like, who is Narion? Still don't know. No. I mean, I do, but just because he's
read. Unimportant. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like
he's basically unimportant, so it doesn't matter. So Elendil, remember Elendilf,
Ellen Daddy,
as we like to say, goes to see. He becomes friends with Gil-galad, and so he's chilling with him. They're not in Eregion because that was destroyed. I don't know. They're chilling somewhere. They're hanging out. And then, side note, I just remembered at some point during all of this, Elrond founded Rivendell. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Like Imladris, as they call it. Imladris. I'm always like, where do I put the emphasis on that
just
word?
Just own it, and then no one will question you.
That's already happened. Basically, he starts going into a description of getting Middle Earth to the point where it's extremely familiar to us as it is in Lord of the Rings. Elendil goes to, I think, the north and starts like founding some stuff in the kingdom of Anor. Then his two sons, Isildur and Anarion, bring their ships up, and this is where I really needed a map. And they like bring their ships up a river. I think it's a river that's like right near Mordor and Gondor, because that's where, spoiler alert, they found Gondor. They start setting things up to be, again, very familiar to us. I didn't realize the real importance of Osgiliath.
I was surprised that it got a shout out here too, because they got one of the well, they called them stones or something, or but it was the Palantiri, right? Like, am I wrong? Is that not what it was?
No, yeah, you're correct.
Okay, good. I was like, they kept calling them something different, and then
the stones.
Yeah, the stones. They're spreading out these stones, and I was like, what? Like the Silmarils are
going
gone.
to all these different
what
geography points.
About?
Yeah,
figured it out though.
Yeah, I was just like very, I don't know, surprised that Osgiliath had all this importance, because this is where Anarion and Isildur, it says their thrones were set side by side in the Great Hall of Osgiliath. Yeah. And then when we see Osgiliath in Return of the King, very, iconic part of the movie, Faramir going off to defend it again. And it's like this crumbling city. And you would have thought that like, when Anarion and Isildur came to Middle Earth, they founded what became Minas Tirith. No, it was Osgiliath, really. It was like their like capital city, and it was like thriving. They built this bridge over the river. And on one side is Minas Ithil, and on the other side is Minas Anor. Very conveniently, Isildur takes Minas Ithil, and Anarion takes Minas Anor. And I'm like, okay, they chose because of the first initials. I can remember that. That's great.
Very helpful.
And again, these are names that were kind of like dropped in Lord of the Rings, and I was like, what does that mean? What's the importance of this?
Wait,
and some people were
I don't even remember that. Jeez.
Yeah, well, I remember because I don't know, I remember being like, are these the two towers?
Okay, nice. Yeah.
Speaking of towers, they also build Orthanc. What else? Long story short, they're establishing a lot of things that are either name dropped or they're like very minor details in Lord of the Rings, like what is it called? Amon Hill. Is that what it's called? What's it called? Amon Sul. That's where in Fellowship of the Ring, I think that's where Frodo at the very end, he like puts the ring on for a minute and then he takes it off, and Aragorn is like, I would have followed you to Mordor. I think that's happening, if I remember correctly, on Amon Sul. So like that's a very minor detail, and then you have a very major detail like Orthanc, which is Saruman's tower. So that's right. trees.
Hey, we're back to the trees, guys. They're important. We love the trees.
When they came over to Middle-earth, when Elendil's dad was saying, like, hey, I'm going to go chat with the Valar, hopefully, maybe they'll help us out of this one. But just in case, put everything that you value and would not wish to part with on these ships and just get ready to roll if things go south. Among all of that are the 7 stones and the white tree. And this is when we get a ancestry tree of a tree.
Yep.
The white tree was grown from the fruit of Nimloth the Fair. So this is the tree that grew in Numenor that Sauron was trying to convince Pharazôn to cut down and burn. And Pharazôn originally wasn't sure about that because there was a prophecy that says, hey, when this tree dies, so will the kingdom. So he wasn't sure about that. And in that time, Isildur snuck in and stole one of the fruits. And then they did destroy the tree. So that fruit grew. And then that tree from Numenor was made in the image of... that tree was descended from the tree of Tyrion that was made in the image of Telperion.
Yes. It is a confusing I did a TikTok about the trees, and I literally had to be like, wait, so it's not a direct descendant. One of them was made in the image of it. It was literally just like okay, I got to figure this out before I say things because I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, it's not like a direct relative, right. But made like in honor or memory of Telperion. This tree that has now made its way to Middle-earth was planted in Minas Ithil in memory of the Eldar and Valinor. And it was, again, it was planted in the house of Isildur because, hey, he's the one who stole the fruit and everything.
Finders keepers. You know?
Yes. Yeah. And then, these stones. What's up with these weird stones? There's 7 of them, and they divide them among Elendil. Elendil gets 3, and then both of the sons each get 2. And they are planted in... Or they put the stones in Minas Ithil, Minas Anor, Orthanc. That one's, I think, the most major one. There's a stone in Orthanc, and Osgiliath, and then Elendil puts them in like 3 locations that I don't know where they are. They're just north.
up with Ellen Daddy. Don't worry about it. He's got this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thus, the Númenóreans were aware of many things that their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped their vigilance in the days of their might. Because they can see things with these stones, pretty much like connected when they're connected, basically like a phone, FaceTiming.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's like, oh, is it a vision? Is it someone playing tricks on me? I don't know. And these are called the Palantiri.
I'm not gonna lie. When I found out that the plural of Palantir was Palantiri, my mind it exploded. So I love all of
I just thought it was I was like, is the plural of Palantir just Palantir?
That's what that would make sense to me. But, I just, Tolkien and his like words, and his languages, it's just all awesome. Every time, just like reading the Silmarillion, even if you can't keep track of all the names, they're all so pretty, it's all good times.
Yes. Yeah. Also just like kind of very like sad and depressing. Elendil every now and then like uses the Palantir to look out upon the sea, and he like thinks that he can see some remains of Numenor. And he's like, oh, maybe we survived. And then the book is like, but no, it was completely destroyed.
R.I.P.
Yeah, it says the yearning of exile was upon him. It is believed that thus he would at whiles see far away even the tower of Avalone upon Eressëa, where the Master Stone abode and yet abides. So that's where like the original one, I guess, sank and is now in the sea. All this is happening. Great. Awesome. Gondor's growing. The, Númenóreans, they're here. It reminds us several times that the Númenóreans are tall. Mm-hmm, they're tall, remember.
Elendil the Tall, right?
Yes.
His nickname.
Yes. Then Sauron is like, okay, I've had a good nap. I'm ready to fight now. He has now become the Eye of Sauron. Remember, everyone, that technically it's not like what Peter Jackson made. It's not supposed to be like a literal eye.
But how iconic, though. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Absolutely iconic.
It's like supposedly more, metaphorical. That like he can see all, I guess. I don't know. He can see far beyond like what he like normally could. I don't know. So yeah, he is preparing for war. Eventually he starts, he's like, well, Gondor's closest. I guess I'll go to them. So he charges on them and I guess takes over Minas Ithil, which is Isildur's family's like side of Gondor, their like territory. And Isildur takes his wife and his kids and they flee, but not before he takes a seed from the tree.
We've got another tree.
And it's a good thing because Sauron chops it down and destroys it, because I'm sure he shows up, they're probably like long gone by this point, and he shows up and he sees the tree and he's like, I thought I got rid of you.
Oh my gosh.
And so he like destroys it again. But yeah, Isildur, which like really surprised me because I thought this tree that made its way over to Middle Earth that they like replanted, I was like, okay, now this is gonna be the tree of Gondor, right?
Not yet.
And then he destroyed it and I was like, oh my god, are you kidding me? How many times are we gonna replant this same tree?
What's the like, I'm drawing a blank here, but isn't there like a phrase from like Scooby-Doo that's like, these meddling humans and their
enough of you meddling kids and your dumb dog.
It's basically like, enough of you meddling humans and your dumb trees. Like that's Sauron basically.
Oh my gosh, yes. He's just like so unnecessarily. And see, this is why like Tolkien has like unknowingly created a great narrative about like climate change and like protecting nature, is that you have this force of evil who is just really mad at trees and he's destroying them left and right.
Hate trees. Deforestation. Yeah, no, yes. Tolkien he's got some points to be made that he's making.
He's like, this is how you really know he's evil. He hates trees.
Exactly.
Isildur and his family and the seed go running off to Daddy and seek refuge with him, and completely like abandons his brother Anarion and is like,
he's fine.
Okay, defend us, Gilead. Bye.
Peace
Good luck
out.
with that.
Have fun.
Now they're like, okay, now Sauron is openly warring with everyone again. Let's go meet him. Let's do this. So they form a league which is called the Last Alliance. Mm-hmm. Very epic. Also, like, ironically, is not going to be the last alliance. Like, there's
true,
like, maybe of this size and nature, but like they still there's a couple more iterations of an army that need to fight Sauron before he's really going to be defeated.
Fully done.
Yes.
Facts, yeah.
And they gather up like all the elves and men that are there. They stop in Imladris and are very like, I think they're very surprised to see that like, oh, things are like flourishing here. You guys are like living a great life. Like there's a lot of you here. I thought all of the elves had run off. Like, okay, I think we've got a pretty good army to go. Mm-hmm. I think we stand a fair chance. They march towards Mordor, and this is, the battle that we see in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring. Mm-hmm. It gets another dig, like we were talking about. It kind of gets a little dig at the dwarves. It says, like, some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. First of all, it's like, just so you know, the elves, we were only the good guys. And then it says, of the dwarves, few fought upon either side.
They just didn't show up.
Seriously? It does mention, however, that Durin's kin did come and fight against Sauron. So like the most important dwarves did show up. So that's cool. But it does say few dwarves fought.
Just gotta call him out like that. Gosh.
Way to call him out.
I do love, though, that gives me hope for the Rings of Power show. Like that all the dwarves that we're growing to love now, we're gonna get to see them in fights, in battles,
Yes. it's very tragic though, because like we know so much about like, okay, well, obviously none of you guys are gonna live, and like as amazing as it is to see all those scenes of Khazad-dûm like in its prime, and there's so much life around it, we know what happened.
I know, it's sad, but it's it's fun. It's honestly, this chapter was so good for me to read specifically because it was just like, oh my gosh, these are things that I know about, not just because I read them in the Silmarillion, right? I've got like semi-reference points from the show and the books and the movie. Yeah, and the movie that it's like, okay, this is it's all very somewhat familiar, at least. Yeah. I just feel like Kronk in The Emperor's New Groove going, oh yeah, it's all coming together. It's all coming together. I love that movie.
Like the dots are connecting.
Yep.
Like finally, after 3 years, the dots are connecting for
here.
Me. Yeah, so they have a huge battle. Everyone who's anyone is there, except for the dwarves.
Except for a lot of the dwarves.
And, no, Durin's kin are there. They're cool. And they fight for 7 years. I didn't know this. That they are... Let me see. Yeah, Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron. And they laid siege to it for 7 years. Dang. That's pure siege. Dedication.
Yeah. We got to get rid of this guy. And then they don't even fully get rid of this guy.
I know, right?
Spoiler alert.
It's also I think it's super interesting. Hang on, let me skim down and make sure before I say something, make sure I'm not going to be completely wrong. Okay. It's just really interesting that Gil-galad here seems to be replaced in the movies by Elrond, because we see a lot of like Elrond's perspective of this battle and like retelling of it. And then it's like, Gil-galad who?
Yeah, literally.
What?
Yeah.
Who? He's not there.
Gil-galad and Elendil, right, were the big like guys, but then you instead hear mainly about Elrond and Isildur, or at least it was like it felt like it was from Elrond's POV almost, kind of, for because he'd like pan to him and all. Anyways,
I thought we were going to see some like mentions of Elrond here, because it does mention that they go to Rivendell, which is like what he founded, but it doesn't really mention much of him fighting. I'm sure he is here. He's just like not as key of a player as we see him in the movie, which like makes sense that if you're going to, there's so many characters that you have to like condense some of them down, if like Gil-galad has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings.
Right.
So of course, like, we're not really going to see him much. I think I have seen people like the Lord of the Ring like wiki pages. If you go to like Gil-galad, it'll be like a blurry zoomed in image of like him, like in the prologue. Yeah, they're like, I think that's supposed to be Gil-galad.
He has like a sick like spear, right? That's his weapon. And so I'm sure if they saw somebody with a really cool spear, they were like, that's it.
That's him. Huge battle, lasts for 7 years, and then things happen that we have heard of before. Actually, before I get there, Anarion was killed. I don't think they ever mentioned that in Lord of the Rings
R.I.P.
or anything.
Anarion.
Anarion is lost in this battle. And then we start getting to the stuff that we've heard before. Where Elendil is killed. Gil-galad is also killed. And the sword of Elendil broke under him as he fell. And Sauron, like in this, fight that they were having, he falls down too for a minute. And Isildur grabs a broken piece of Narsil, the sword of Elendil, and he uses it it just says, cutting the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron, and took it for his own. So I imagine he cut his finger off. I guess you can't cut metal that can only be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom. I guess you can't cut it, but it also just says cut the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron. So he's, I guess, just running around with a severed finger and a ring.
Gross.
And he took it for his own. And Sauron for that time was vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. And the end. Nothing else ever happens.
Nope, that's it. It's a happy ending.
That is where we are going to leave this week's episode, though. And next week, we will be back to, oh my gosh, I wonder what's going to happen.
A mystery.
I no clue. Although I will say I am interested to see like how far this section goes into the future and like how much it's going to, if it's even going to say like, and then some hobbits came along and you know, so I'm like, how far are we going to go? And is it just going to get to a point where it just like flows right into the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring? And then I just start the podcast all over again.
Well, I know, but I'm not going to tell you. I did like the end, though, of the Silmarillion. I found it pleasant read.
Yeah, I'm looking forward, like, in more ways than one. I'm looking forward to the end of this. But it's kind of nice to be finishing this out on a story that I'm already familiar with. Yeah, interesting how we don't know much about the Rings of Power still.
Just kind of glosses over
just
some
really
of it. You know, it's just like, it's one of those things, what do they call them? A soft magic system where, you know, things just happen. And that's
it really is
what happened.
Oh, and also really worth mentioning that there's like I think the paragraph describing the geography of Middle Earth when Elendil and Isildur and Anarion, when they come and they start founding things and then describing like the tree, I think that section is longer than the entire like Battle of the Last Alliance.
I think
like he
right.
really did it in like 3 paragraphs, like this huge epic battle, and Tolkien's like, yeah, and then they battled for 7 years, and then eventually Gil-galad and Elendil died, and then Sauron was defeated for that time.
You know, if it were me and I was like, you know, somebody who was trying to tell somebody what happened in Middle-earth, that's probably what I would do. So, you know, as I said, not a battles girly, so just kind of say what happened. We don't need the details. Then we could just move on. Though I might have appreciated some more details about how the rings
About the
work.
Rings of Power. Especially since that's the name of this chapter.
Yeah. I could have used a little more detail there.
Well, Kritter, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure discussing this interesting piece of Tolkien with you.
Oh, thank you for
Where
having
can
me.
people find you on the internet?
Oh my gosh, I'm all over the place. But I do TikToks. I'm KritterXD on TikTok. I do Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, a bunch of sci-fi fantasy stuff. I have a YouTube channel where I do similar things, reaction videos, interviews, what have you. I'm Egwene Alvear on Twitter as well as myself. So I've got an in-character account that's Wheel of Time focused. Also on Instagram, I have a Discord. Like, if you just like type in KritterXD, that's Kritter with a K, you'll find me.
Awesome. And listeners, for anyone who has ever suggested to me that I do Wheel of Time next, I am going to instead direct you to KritterXD's content. Just go check out her stuff. I will not ever be doing Wheel of Time. Thank you. It just seems like a lot.
It is
same with like Game of Thrones. Those are the two that I know. The whole joke of me doing the Silmarillion is that I always said I was never going to do the Silmarillion. So I guess like never say never, but I'm like 99% sure that I won't do Wheel of Time and I won't do Game of Thrones.
So you're saying there's a chance.
That's What I'm Talking About is a proud member of WBNE. If you want to learn more about the network, you can go to WBNE.org. The cover art is by Vaishon Brandon. You can support him on Instagram at Vaishon Designs. You can get merch for That's What I'm Talking About by going to tpublic.com/user/talkingaboutpod. Hey, the holidays are coming up. I think it's the perfect time to gift that Tolkien nerd in your life a That's What I'm Talking About t-shirt, or perhaps a sticker or sweatshirt. Even if they're not a listener of the podcast, That's What I'm Talking About is a pun that everyone can appreciate. You can follow the podcast on social media at TolkienAboutPod. You can find me on Twitter and TikTok at MCWatsUp and on Instagram at MCTurndownForWhat. You can support the podcast by going to patreon.com/TolkienAboutPod. Take a gander at the different levels of support. I appreciate patrons of all levels, but especially our sponsors each week, like Irina. Irina, thank you so much for your continued support of the podcast. You're a wonderful person. Yeah, that's it. Hard stop. You're a wonderful person. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any parting words for the audience?
Just, if you're struggling with the Silmarillion, it's a good thing to have read, even though it is really hard. And don't feel bad, because it is really hard.
And that's what I'm Tolkien about.